A judge fined her $200 for wearing a simple gold cross necklace. What happened next silenced the courtroom, flipped a civil rights case on its head, and left the entire nation talking. By the end of the day, she wasn't just a woman in the front row. She was a legal force the judge had to apologize to. Want to know how a quiet act of defiance became a viral lesson in power, justice, and grace? Stick around, because this courtroom story is unlike anything you've heard before. Before we dive into this unbelievable courtroom moment, if stories of truth, courage, and quiet power speak to you, hit that like button to show your support. And tell me in the comments, what would you have done in Jasmine's place? If you're new here, subscribe and turn on notifications. We tell stories that matter, the kind that don't just go viral, they go deep. The courtroom was already tense by 9:12 a.m. in Dallas County. It was day 4 of Monroe v. Ashland Correctional, a quiet but increasingly talked about civil rights case involving allegations of excessive force in a local prison. There were no national news crews, just a few local journalists, law students, and curious retirees scattered among the benches, sipping lukewarm coffee and scribbling notes. Then, something shifted. The back door opened, and in walked Jasmine Crockett. Not as a lawyer, not as a congresswoman, just an observer. That was the plan anyway. She wore a sharp black blazer and carried only a worn leather-bound notebook. No assistant, no fanfare, no press. But one thing stood out immediately. A simple gold cross necklace resting just below her collarbone. Aged, smooth, and clearly meaningful. It wasn't shiny or flashy, it looked like something passed down through generations. And it was. Jasmine quietly took a seat in the front row, directly behind the plaintiff, Mr. Cecil Monroe. She crossed her legs at the ankle, nodded subtly to the lead attorney Lauren Gates, and flipped open her notebook. No phone, no distractions, just presence. Minutes later, Judge Raymond Driscoll entered the room. Known for his strict decorum, Driscoll had the kind of reputation that made people hide their Starbucks cups and sit up straighter. He scanned the courtroom with eyes sharp from years on the bench, and then his gaze landed on Jasmine. At first he said nothing, then narrowing his eyes he spoke. "Madam, excuse me, you in the front row?" Jasmine looked up calmly. "Yes, Your Honor." "May I ask you to remove that necklace?" The room paused. A chill moved through the benches. Even the attorney's pen froze mid-stroke. Jasmine responded, voice steady. "It's a personal item, not a statement." "Be that as it may," Driscoll replied, tapping his gavel lightly. "This is a court of law. Religious symbols that may be seen as political or prejudicial aren't allowed within view of the jury." There were no outbursts, but the tension was palpable. Phones vibrated silently in pockets. Someone in the hallway was already texting about what just happened. Jasmine didn't argue. She didn't grandstand. She simply said, "I'm here in a personal capacity, Your Honor, but I respectfully decline to remove the necklace. It's not for show." There was a long pause, then the judge delivered his decision. "Very well. You are fined $200 for violating courtroom dress protocol. Bailiff, make a note." A soft ripple of murmurs rolled through the courtroom, but Jasmine, she nodded once, opened her notebook and kept writing. She didn't flinch, she didn't leave, she didn't even blink. To most, it might have looked like a small moment. But for those paying attention, it was clear. Something had just shifted in the room. The quiet woman in the front row, the one wearing the cross, was about to become the center of the storm. The hearing resumed after the judge's tense exchange with Jasmine Crockett. But the energy in the room had undeniably changed. Everyone, from the gallery to the jury, was now aware of her. The woman in the front row fined for wearing a cross, who hadn't so much as raised her voice in response. She simply kept writing, her calm defiance speaking louder than any objection ever could. Lead attorney Lauren Gates pressed on, presenting her case for Cecil Monroe, a 67-year-old Vietnam veteran who had been mistakenly held in Denton County's Ashland Correctional Facility and who had come out battered, bruised, and permanently injured after just 2 weeks. She laid out the facts. Clerical error, wrongful detainment, excessive force, photos, medical reports, eyewitness statements. Lauren spoke clearly, but the stress was beginning to show in her shoulders. The defense, represented by the smooth and smug Daniel Sturgis, pounced. He tried to discredit Monroe's injuries, implying pre-existing conditions and referencing a decades-old bar fight. He painted Monroe not as a victim of abuse, but as a man too quick to claim injustice. And Judge Driscoll? He allowed nearly every defense maneuver. Overruled objections, dismissed concerns, allowed invasive and irrelevant lines of questioning. Each time Sturgis scored a point, Jasmine's pen moved. Not doodling, not distracted, but diagramming. Her notebook was becoming a quiet war plan. Then came the break. 10 minutes. Most people stood, stretched, or made their way to the hallway. Jasmine remained seated, quietly focused. The bailiff approached her. "You plan on staying the whole time?" "I do." "You gonna pay that fine?" "I am. But not today." He hesitated, then walked off. Moments later, a small moment of grace, Lauren dropped her file. Papers scattered across the floor. Without hesitation, Jasmine rose to help her gather them. "You okay?" she asked softly. "Yeah, just a long morning," Lauren replied, visibly rattled. Jasmine handed her the last sheet and whispered, "You're doing better than they want you to think." Then, with a hint of realness, "You think Driscoll would have fined a man for wearing a yarmulke?" Lauren paused, gave a knowing look. "No, I don't." A quiet, shared truth. The kind that passes between women who've learned to read the subtext. But no one expected what would happen next. The room refilled. Everyone settled. Judge Driscoll returned, expression unreadable. Lauren stepped forward, her hand pressing subtly against her abdomen. She began questioning Monroe on the stand. "Mr. Monroe, can you tell us what happened on the morning of January 12th? Cecil described the assault. Being yanked from his cell while half asleep. Slammed against a wall. Face hitting cement. A moment of silence that followed the violence. Lauren nodded, but her body betrayed her. Her breath shortened, her shoulders stiffened, her voice thinned. Then it happened. She blinked, swayed, and collapsed. Hard. "Lauren?" Jasmine was already up before anyone else could react. A collective gasp. The bailiff rushed over. A nurse in the gallery leapt to help. Someone called 911. The courtroom, so still moments earlier, became chaos. Paramedics arrived within minutes and carefully lifted Lauren onto a stretcher. Pale, sweating, barely conscious, she hadn't said a word about being unwell. Cecil stood at the witness box, stunned. "Your Honor, we can't wait for another delay," he said, voice cracking. "I got no money left for another lawyer." He looked around, then locked eyes with Jasmine. "You can, right?" he said, almost pleading. "You're a lawyer, ain't you?" The room went absolutely still. Jasmine didn't jump. She didn't smile. She didn't posture. "I'm here in a personal capacity," she said carefully. "I'm not part of this case." "But you could be," Monroe pressed. "You've been sitting here taking notes the whole time. You know what's going on. Please." Judge Driscoll turned to her, for once with uncertainty. "Miss Crockett, are you licensed to practice in Texas?" "I am." "And are you willing to assume representation on record?" A beat of silence. Jasmine glanced at Cecil, then the folder on the table. Then the judge. "I need a moment to review the file." "You'll have 10 minutes, Driscoll said. "But I'll allow it." Gasps. Whispers. A hum of disbelief rippling through the gallery. Jasmine stepped forward, took her place behind the plaintiff's table, opened the case file with the calm of someone used to being underestimated. She didn't ask for help. She didn't stall. She just started reading. The clock was ticking. Jasmine Crockett had exactly 10 minutes to review a case she hadn't prepared for. No warning, no notes. Just a folder full of scattered arguments, witness affidavits, grainy surveillance images, and a man, Cecil Monroe, clinging to the faint hope that someone, anyone, might fight for him. While most people in the courtroom were still recovering from the shock of seeing the lead attorney collapse, Jasmine was already working. Her eyes flew across the pages, flipping, circling, annotating. But this wasn't frantic. It was precise, purposeful. The kind of mental agility that doesn't come from titles, it comes from experience. Across the aisle, Daniel Sturgis, defense counsel, leaned back in his chair, smirking, tapping his watch. His body language screamed one thing: she's not ready. And to him, this was just a procedural hiccup, a break in rhythm, nothing serious. He was wrong. When Judge Driscoll returned and called the courtroom back to order, he gave a curt nod. "Miss Crockett, you are now counsel of record for the plaintiff." Jasmine stood slowly, unfolded herself with deliberate calm, straightened her blazer. The courtroom, now fully reassembled, leaned in. Even some of the jurors who had been passive for most of the proceedings sat forward. Jasmine began her opening statement. But there was no courtroom drama in her voice. No theatrics, no legal grandstanding. Instead, she spoke plainly, like someone offering truth as a gift, not a weapon. My client, Mr. Monroe, isn't here to stir emotion. He's here because the law was broken. Not bent, broken, and not in theory, but in flesh. She stepped slightly closer to the jury box. He was held without cause. That's the first mistake. But being beaten while waiting for release, that's not a mistake. That's malice. That's abuse. And it's unconstitutional. Sturgis jumped up. Objection. Argumentative. Judge Driscoll barely looked at him. She's in opening remarks. Overruled. That wiped the smirk off his face. Jasmine turned and tapped a button on the evidence screen behind her. Slide 1. Monroe's intake form. At the bottom, release approved January 11th, 4:18 p.m. This document proves that Mr. Monroe was already cleared to leave, but on the morning of January 12th, before he was released, he was assaulted. Why? She flipped to the next slide. Slide 2. Medical report. Cracked ribs, facial bruising, radial nerve damage in the left arm. These aren't exaggerations. They're not emotional appeals. They're medical facts. From the defense table, Sturgis exhaled loudly, arms folded. Let him, Jasmine thought. She moved to surveillance logs, footage showing guards entering Monroe's cell nearly an hour before their shift officially began. Why were they there? Why that early? None of this was new evidence, but the way she was connecting it, quickly, cleanly, was unlike anything this courtroom had seen yet. Then came her masterstroke. She returned to the table and pulled out a laminated card from the Ashland Correctional Employee Handbook. Use of force protocol, highlighted in yellow. Force may be used only as a last resort when there is a clear and present threat. She raised it slightly, letting the jury read it with her. Mr. Monroe is 67 years old. He suffers from degenerative joint disease. He walks with a limp. He was asleep when the officers entered. What threat did he pose? Silence. The jury was locked in. One juror blinked hard, visibly processing. Another shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Even Judge Driscoll leaned forward, fingers steepled beneath his chin. There was no warning, no explanation, no justification, just pain. Back at the defense table, Sturgis was scribbling notes furiously. His body language now radiated panic disguised as control. But Jasmine wasn't finished. She clicked again. Slide 3, Internal Corrections Report. Redacted, but clearly time-stamped. January 12th, an incident report quietly filed and never disclosed to Monroe's legal team. She let it linger. You can redact a name, but you can't redact a pattern. Then she paused. For the first time since she started speaking, she let a moment breathe. My client has been waiting 2 years to be heard. And I don't believe this courtroom exists to ignore people who don't come in wearing suits and speaking legalese. I believe it exists to make things right. She sat down. No dramatic pause, no nod to the gallery, just quiet, unwavering confidence. The room didn't erupt, it just froze. In the kind of stillness that only happens when something powerful has just shifted. Judge Driscoll glanced toward the jury, then toward Sturgis. Defense may proceed. But now it was different. Sturgis stood and made his case. Same voice, same posture, but it didn't land. His confidence had curdled into defensiveness. The jury wasn't listening to him anymore. They were still watching Jasmine Crockett. Defense attorney Daniel Sturgis took the floor, trying to regain his footing. He stood before the jury, voice softened, carefully measured, the kind of performance you'd expect from a man who'd built a career on persuading people to ignore what they just saw and heard. Ladies and gentlemen, he began smoothly, this case is not about injustice. It's about interpretation, memory, the reality of a difficult environment being mistaken for cruelty. He clicked the remote. Image, Cecil Monroe walking out of Ashland Correctional. No wheelchair, no blood, just him walking, flanked by 2 guards. No injuries, no trauma, visible, Sturgis said. He turned back to the jury, hands open in mock sincerity. Pain is real, but pain is also subjective, and people can misremember. He let that hang, confident. Cecil shifted in his chair, clearly uncomfortable. Jasmine, seated beside him, placed a quiet hand on his forearm, a gesture of reassurance, not restraint. But Sturgis wasn't done. He moved to discredit the key witness, Jerome King, a fellow inmate who had submitted a sworn statement detailing the assault. You'll hear from this witness, Sturgis said, but ask yourselves, how credible is a man serving time for perjury? He let the words hang like poison in the air. Let the jurors chew on them. Then he sat down smug once again. The judge looked to Jasmine. "Miss Crockett, cross-examination?" She stood. Calm, focused, not a single wasted movement. "Yes, Your Honor." She approached the evidence screen. "Mr. Sturgis stated my client walked out of the facility unaided, and that this somehow implies the absence of injury." She tapped the screen once, zoomed in on the medical log. "Checkup conducted 14 hours after the alleged incident." "But this report," she said, "this was filed long after the incident took place. There's a gap, nearly a full day, where no medical evaluation was made. So let me ask," she turned to Sturgis, eyes locked, "can you confirm that between the time of the assault and the time of this report, no medical assessment was performed?" A pause. Sturgis hesitated, then muttered, "Yes, per the timeline, that's accurate." Jasmine nodded once, then looked directly at the jury. "We're not talking about a paper cut. We're talking about fractured ribs, nerve damage. These aren't speculative injuries. They're documented, and they were ignored." She let that sink in, then pivoted. "Now, about the witness. Jerome King." She held up a copy of King's criminal record. "Yes, Mr. King has a conviction. 5 years ago for signing a false affidavit in a property dispute. It's there, I'm not hiding it." She walked to the center of the courtroom. "But here's what Mr. Sturgis didn't mention. Jerome King came forward voluntarily. No deal, no promise, no leverage. He asked to testify knowing his past would be used against him." She held up another document, the facility's own internal surveillance log. "He described officers entering Monroe's cell at 5:38 a.m. This log matches. He said there were 3 guards. This log, 3 names listed, redacted, but consistent." The jury was leaning in now. Even the skeptical ones were staring with furrowed brows, trying to keep up with the thread she was weaving and realizing it was ironclad. "Now ask yourselves," she said, voice steady, "how would Mr. King know details that match internal logs he never saw? How would he guess correctly unless he was telling the truth?" One juror, a woman in her 60s, arms folded tightly earlier, slowly uncrossed her arms. Jasmine moved to her final piece of evidence for the day. "This," she said, holding up a printed report, "was never shared with the Monroe family. It's a redacted incident report from Ashland Correctional, filed the morning of January 12th, the exact day of the alleged assault." She distributed copies to the clerk, then addressed the courtroom again. "This isn't hearsay, this isn't emotion, this is documentation that supports the truth Mr. Monroe has carried alone for 2 years." And then she paused. A long breath. Her eyes scanned the room. Then she did something no one expected. She touched her necklace. "Before I sit down, I want to address something that happened this morning. Not as a lawyer, but as a woman who walked into this courtroom believing justice wasn't just possible, but necessary." The courtroom was silent. "This cross belonged to my grandmother, Elsie Redmond, born 1930. Couldn't vote until she was nearly 40. She believed in law and in faith. She said the two weren't enemies, only misunderstood by people afraid of accountability." A ripple moved through the gallery. "I was fined $200 for wearing this necklace, because someone believed it might send the wrong message." She looked directly at Judge Driscoll, not in defiance, but in truth. "But if a necklace threatens objectivity, maybe the problem isn't the necklace. Maybe it's what it represents." For a moment, even the air felt still. Jasmine returned to her seat. She didn't smile. She didn't soak in applause. She simply waited. And in that silence, heavier than any gavel, the courtroom began to realize this wasn't just a trial. This was a reckoning. The courtroom was no longer just a room. It had become a crucible, one where law, identity, and principle were being tested under pressure. And at the center of that crucible stood Jasmine Crockett, now seated beside her client, Cecil Monroe, her hands calmly folded over her notes. Her closing argument had not been loud, theatrical, or combative, but it had been exact, laced with precedent, anchored in pain, sharpened by purpose. Even Judge Driscoll, known for his icy detachment, was now sitting straighter behind the bench, his fingers interlocked beneath his chin, his demeanor more alert, more human. As the judge prepared to dismiss the jury for deliberation, he paused, looking at Jasmine with something between respect and realization. "Then, the court will recess for deliberation. Jury will remain sequestered." The bailiff opened the door. The jurors filed out, glancing once more at Jasmine. not in politeness, but as if seeking permission to render the justice she had so meticulously demanded. Time passed like it always does in moments of high stakes, slowly. Outside, the afternoon light slanted through the high windows, dust catching in golden shafts. Inside, the courtroom buzzed with quiet murmurs, shifting papers, whispered guesses. Cecil said nothing. He just sat beside Jasmine, his hands clasped tightly together, knuckles white. "Whatever happens," he said, voice low. "Thank you." She nodded. A small gesture but grounded. "Real." Then came the sound. The door opened. The jury was back. Driscoll adjusted his glasses and nodded toward the clerk. "Has the jury reached a verdict?" The foreperson, a middle-aged woman with tired eyes but steady hands, stood. "We have, Your Honor." The envelope passed hands. Driscoll read silently. No reaction. He returned the envelope. "In the matter of Monroe v. Ashland Correctional, on the count of use of excessive force in violation of the Eighth Amendment." A pause. "We find in favor of the plaintiff." The courtroom exhaled, audibly, and award damages in the amount of $285,000. Gasps. Not dramatic ones, just real, like someone had cracked open a tightly sealed room and let fresh air in. One person whispered, "They actually did it." Another, "That woman." But Cecil Monroe didn't move. He didn't pump a fist, didn't shout. He just sat there, still, blinking at the bench, as if trying to understand that for the first time in 2 years, someone had finally believed him. Officially. His lips trembled slightly, but he didn't cry. It was more like something had lifted. Not all the pain, but some of the weight. Jasmine didn't cheer. She didn't even exhale. She just reached out, placed a hand on Cecil's arm, and gave it a single, steady squeeze. Respect. Solidarity. Completion. Judge Driscoll tapped his gavel. Court is adjourned. People began to rise. Journalists in the gallery reached for their phones. Lawyers exchanged glances. Even Sturgis looked stunned, his briefcase still unopened, his closing argument unused. But then, something unusual. "Miss Crockett," Judge Driscoll said. She stopped. "A word, please." She looked at him, curious. Not defiant, just present. Everyone else began filing out, murmuring. In the hallway, the hum of approaching cameras could already be heard. But Jasmine walked back toward the bench. Judge Driscoll stepped down from the platform. No robe now, just the man behind the title. He waited until the last legal assistant left the room before he spoke, his voice low but unshaking. "Miss Crockett, I reviewed the fine I issued this morning." She said nothing. She let him go on. "I was wrong." Still, she remained silent. Just listening, letting him arrive at his own reckoning. "It wasn't about the necklace," he said finally. "It was about control. I didn't expect to be challenged, especially not by someone who walked in as an observer." Jasmine tilted her head slightly. Not smug, just honest. He continued, lifting a signed document from the bench. "I've stricken the fine from the record, signed the dismissal myself." A beat of silence. Then he added, this time with something more vulnerable in his voice, "You were the sharpest lawyer in the room today, even when you weren't supposed to be in it." Jasmine gave the smallest of smiles. "I didn't come here to prove anything, Your Honor." "I know," he said, nodding. "That's what made it work." Then she turned to leave. No victory lap, no final stare down. But as she reached the door, Driscoll asked one final question. "That necklace, how long have you had it?" She looked over her shoulder. "Since I passed the bar," she said. "But I've worn it longer." He nodded slowly. "Don't stop." And just like that, she was gone. Jasmine Crockett stepped out of the Dallas County Courthouse alone. No legal team. No media rep. No fanfare. Just a woman in a black blazer with a worn leather notebook under one arm and a gold cross necklace catching the afternoon sun as it rested quietly at her collarbone. Reporters were already waiting, clustered on the courthouse steps like bees around a story. Tripods in place. Boom mics hovering. Photographers adjusting lenses to capture the face that had just turned a routine civil rights hearing into something far more electric. The moment she appeared, the swarm moved. "Congresswoman Crockett, did you expect to win today? Are you representing more civil cases now? Was the judge's fine really about the necklace, or about who you are?" Jasmine raised a single hand, not aggressively, not dismissively, just steady. "I came here today in a personal capacity," she said. "I didn't plan to argue a case, but when someone needed help, and the law stood in front of them like a wall, I couldn't sit quietly and watch." The press leaned in. The court ruled in Mr. Monroe's favor, and that's what justice looks like. A voice called from the back. Did Judge Driscoll apologize for the fine? There it was, the moment everyone was really waiting for. Jasmine paused. Just a second. Not coy, just measured. Let's just say, she replied, we had a respectful conversation, and a fine that was issued was later withdrawn. She could have stopped there. Most politicians would have, but Jasmine Crockett wasn't performing, she was leading. I think sometimes people confuse authority with correctness, she added, looking directly into the cameras. Being in charge doesn't mean you're always right, but being willing to change your mind, that's leadership. That quote would hit headlines within the hour. She descended the steps. One camera operator tried to follow her, keeping pace, angling for more. She didn't speed up, she didn't wave anyone off, she just walked, calm, focused, composed until she reached the sidewalk. Then, without looking back, she turned right and disappeared into the streets of downtown Dallas. Back inside, a very different moment was unfolding. Judge Raymond Driscoll, no robe now, no bench, exited quietly through a side door, accompanied only by a clerk. He didn't expect anyone to notice him, but a local reporter did. Judge Driscoll, any comment on today's ruling? He paused. This was the kind of question he usually brushed off with a stiff nod or a vague procedural line. But today wasn't like any other day. He turned, looked straight at the camera, and said, I was reminded today that brilliance doesn't always wear a robe. Sometimes, it just walks in, sits down quietly, and waits for the right moment to speak. The reporter blinked. You're referring to Miss Crockett? Driscoll nodded. And the fine? He exhaled slowly. It was never about jewelry, he said. That necklace didn't challenge the court. My assumption did. Then he turned and walked away. No follow-up, no spin, just truth. The kind that's hard to say and even harder to ignore. Meanwhile, Jasmine Crockett had vanished into a small used bookstore on the corner of Commerce and Griffin. No press followed her in. Inside, she browsed quietly. She wasn't buying law books or anything flashy. Just one thing, a used copy of Gideon's Trumpet, the story of Clarence Earl Gideon, a poor man who took his fight for legal representation all the way to the Supreme Court and helped reshape American justice. As she handed it to the cashier, the clerk looked at her and said, Wait, are you the lady from the courthouse? Jasmine smiled, just someone who loves the Constitution. That evening, the world caught up. A grainy 57-second leaked courtroom video surfaced online, recorded sneakily by someone in the gallery. It showed Jasmine standing beside the screen, her hand grazing the cross necklace as she delivered one line that would echo across platforms. If you're afraid of a necklace, maybe it's not the symbol that's threatening. By nightfall, the clip was everywhere. Twitter, TikTok, YouTube, cable news, commentators debated it, activists shared it, teachers uploaded it to classroom portals. In Phoenix, a high school civics teacher played it for her 11th grade students. By 8:17 a.m., a student who had never raised his hand all semester asked, Wait, can judges really do that? In Kansas, an elderly Vietnam vet posted the clip with the caption, We fought for this. She reminded them why. In Milwaukee, a pastor paused mid-sermon, pulled out his phone, and showed the clip during Bible study. That, he said, pointing to her steady stance and measured voice, is what it looks like to walk into fire with grace. Media outlets raced to label it, Congresswoman Saves Civil Rights Trial in Courtroom Twist, the gold cross that challenged power, Jasmine Crockett, from observer to legal icon. But one outlet got closer to the truth. Crockett doesn't wear power, she wields it. Yet the most important headlines never made print. They happened in homes, classrooms, barbershops, veterans' halls, where people who had stopped believing in justice saw a quiet woman with a notebook and a cross walk into a courtroom, speak when it mattered most, and remind everyone what real leadership looks like. Sometimes, the most powerful voice in the room doesn't start out speaking. It sits quietly, observes, waits, and when the moment calls, it doesn't shout, it shows up. Jasmine Crockett didn't walk into that courtroom looking to make history. She walked in wearing a cross that carried her grandmother's legacy and walked out carrying the weight of a legal victory, a viral moment, and a renewed belief in what justice can still look like. In an age of noise, posturing, and performance, she reminded us that truth doesn't need volume. It needs courage. It needs conviction. And sometimes, It just needs someone willing to say, "That's not right," and mean it. So the next time someone tells you power is about status, title, or control, remember this story. Because real power? It wears grace like armor, and doesn't ask for permission to do what's right. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe if this story moved you. And let us know in the comments. What does courage look like to you?